Now move on to the talk by Professor Theodore Lewis, who will take us through some of the experiences in the United States dealing with the question of social justice and education.
Good morning to my colleagues here, and I want to thank the organizers, Rohit and others, for inviting me. Christopher Winch, I know you probably had something to do with it. Thank you for that. I am Theodore Lewis. I am from the Caribbean, West Indies, as you may say in India. I've lived 25 years of my life in the United States, and I have some insights that come from that. I taught at University of Minnesota for 20 years, and I am fundamentally an educator. I don't have any claims to be a philosopher, but I do have concerns of a sort of existential nature. The question of the lived experiences of the underclasses, and I couldn't help over the period of my time as an adult and scholar to take those issues on. I suppose I have a sort of a personal stake in this. My daughter is an American. She was born there while I was going to school, and now I have a granddaughter who is an American. And her education now has become a priority, as the education of my daughter was a priority. I am not here to criticize America. I have benefited fairly substantially from American education, as has my daughter. I am going to try to comment and to critique America if I could. And I think that in that critique, there are lessons for places like India and places like South Africa, for example, after apartheid. The American story about struggle and dealing with inequality is a struggle that all of us in this room should pay attention to. The line I'm going to take is somewhat historical, because I'm going to anchor what I have to say in the period of slavery. And much of the troubles that we would see in America these days with respect to inequality and persistent inequality are deeply rooted, they're congenital, and they go back to a certain abhorrence that the society might have for the other. So I will begin early on, and then I will introduce Dewey and Dewey's notions of what a democratic state entails, and some of the debates that Dewey had when vocational education was to be introduced in the US in the schools. As you will see, vocational education, which in its own right is useful education, became a tool of division in the curriculum. And then I will walk you all the way through till the current times, where they are talking about STEM education and finding deficiencies in minority populations with respect to science and so on. Excuse me, and the impetus there is essentially economic. And sometimes you have to, thank you. Sometimes you'd see that they have to resort to instrumental arguments to try to make equality happen. So, in the abstract, I say that while the United States prides itself as being a global exemplar of the democratic state, a close look at the society's social history will reveal continuing challenges and nagging resistances to the idea of freedom and equality for all in America. In education, much of this has to do with the country's cosmopolitan nature and makeup. As each constituent group makes democratic claims, whether minorities, women, or undocumented immigrants, the society must adjust. Since the end of the Civil War and the freeing of slaves, the country has had to come to terms with the question how to guarantee the basic right of all citizens to be treated equally before the law, and how to assure that each citizen find unimpeded pathways to the American dream, so-called. Education has been an important way in which the country has sought to make freedom and equality the experience of all. But this is difficult work. It's not easy. It is a task that remains unfinished. In his book, Democracy and Education, Dewey explained that to attain the democratic ideal requires identification of what constituent groups in the society hold in common. The ferment that attends this quest sets the stage for education. I noticed in Indian society recently, when Sachin was going to play his last game, that the country, all of India, were focused on one man. It just happened that the losing side was West Indies, which was not good. This article reflects upon aspects of the long and bumpy road that the country continues to travel, the US, especially where social justice claims of Afro-Americans are concerned, as it tries to live up to Dewey's ideal. The paper is about what seems like a perpetual American struggle to live up to the democratic claims through the creation of conditions that will allow citizens equal access to education and equal quality education. This far out from the country's founding, the question of equal access to education remains unsettled and the object of contest. Valid cries about inequalities and inequities in educational provision along socioeconomic, racial, and gender lines can still be heard. To its credit, the country has always sought along the way to respond politically and legislatively to calls from particular communities for justice, for social justice through education. But it is also the case that from its early history, seen especially in slaveholding states in the American South, education has been a highly politicized good in the country, being made a right to be claimed only by the slaveholding class. Slave codes, which spelled out the conditions of a slave's existence, and which defined the lines he could not cross, always prohibited reading and writing. To teach an African slave to read or to write was to break the law and to face sanction. A slave found breaking a literacy law could be flogged or worse. This connection between literacy and the rejection of a status of servitude is a probable reason why, for blacks in particular, resistances to calls for equality in education are unceasing. The sociologist Ralph Turner offered the framework sponsored versus contest mobility to help explain American and English differences in their disposition to educational provision. The UK disposition sponsored mobility. Entry into the progression within the system is governed by ruling classes who set the bar as to who could get in. Entry into the system is determined early. Who gets in is determined by the elite members who believe that only a small portion of claimants have the ability to be successful. Under contest mobility, according to Turner, the American way, the goal is elite status, which theoretically can be attained by perseverance. Turner identified the issue of the disadvantaged as the biggest social control challenge for the contest system, since the disadvantaged must come to accept that they will receive disproportionately less of the goods on offer in the system. The strategy for this is future orientation. The disadvantaged classes must be convinced that ultimately they will arrive at the goal. And this is not a false promise. It actually happens in the States. The plausibility of this future orientation tempers untoward attitudes among the underclasses towards the system, because you see that some minorities are actually getting into the middle class and so on. So you can't have a blanket disposition that says minorities are shut out. Harriet Morgan, in a 1990 article in Oxford Review, found merit in Turner's framework, pointing out that in the sponsored British system, there's much focus on early separation of children with the academic fitness to go on from those not so deemed. In the UK system of sponsorship, there's pressure to overcome early deficits by years 16 to 18. In the US, there's not this time pressure. But the American contest system, with its message of postponement to the underclasses, while it has the strength of giving the motivated a shot at the prize of elite status, has severe flaws, in my view, that have led to rounds of reform with persistent stumbling blocks in recent decades. A very critical dimension of this system, upon which Turner was silent in the theory, is the idea of local control of education and funding via property taxes. Since all communities are not equal in terms of wealth, this means simply that rich communities can afford better schools than poor ones. It is also the case in the US that there is high correlation between ethnicity, race, and socioeconomic status. This fact of the connection between wealth and the quality of education on offer is a key to understanding perpetual tensions in American education. Many in the privileged classes will prefer if their children continue to hold an edge in opportunity and power in the society. This is according to Bowles and Gintis in Schooling in Capitalist America. For most of the 20th century, the US was satisfied with the educational status quo. What has provoked recent decades of reform, still in progress, was the relative decline of American economic competitiveness, particularly in manufacturing, starkly documented in Bluestone and Harrison's work, The Deindustrialization of America. Indeed, there was a new global economy that saw the rise of newly industrialized countries, including the so-called Asian tigers. These countries placed greater emphasis on schooling and education. Some of these countries redefined what it meant, the pathways to development that some theorists had. These countries place great emphasis, the more recent focus on STEM, science, technology, and so on, as the basis of competitive advantage, has brought China and India into the discussion in the US about the need to reduce inequalities in education. From the end of African slavery till contemporary times, the US has had to come to terms with the reality of an approach to education that was uneven in application where blacks are concerned. To the country's credit, it has over time acknowledged the situation and attempted action, but there are resistances. Inequality in education has proved to be too intractable a problem just to disappear. After the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War of 1861 to 65, former slaveholders, the landowning class, were bent on reestablishing the status quo of segregated society. Following a brief period of Reconstruction in which there were federal efforts to provide blacks an equal footing, there were virulent campaigns of terror and so on blacks. In addition to violence, the rights of blacks to the franchise was taken away. Education for the children of ex-slaves in common schools was out of the question. The question of slaves as citizens. The difficulty that the US faced at the end of the Civil War was that following Western canon, citizen and slave are mutually exclusive categories. But short decades after the abolition of slavery, black voices rose, amplified by the advocacy of philanthropists, making a claim for the education of ex-slaves. In their discussion of Plato's attitudes to slaves in his Laws, Maital and Agassi show only that the slave was property, inanimate, mindless, deserving of the vilest sanctions. Slaves could have opinion, but not knowledge. Slaves could not qualify for public activity, political, legal, and so on. That's the canon. During American slavery, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, had asked Frederick Douglass, himself a slave and then a slave organizer, whether there was anything she could do for his race on the educational front. He replied that industrial schools could be of practical benefit. At the end of slavery, another ex-slave, Booker T. Washington, whose Southern roots and understandings, plus his eloquence, and his espousal of the idea of blacks and whites living separate but equal existences, had earned him the air of the Southern plantocracy. He established an industrial school for blacks at Tuskegee. The Southern planter class, who saw vocational education as being peculiarly fitted to blacks and not challenging of the social status quo, went along with Washington. That's an important strand in what I have to say here. Washington, of course, was conscious of the irony that the curriculum based on work could now be the basis of the education of an ex-slave. But he was of the firm view that it was not work itself that was degrading. It was the institution of slavery. Other black leaders of the time disagreed. W.E. Du Bois, for example, violently agreed with Washington, thinking that this education was going to be the basis of segregation. He chastised Washington on his advocacy in his book, The Souls of Black Folks. But Washington was willing, in the circumstances, to go for what the social market would bear. The whole loaf of liberal education was not forthcoming. Rather than engaging, and I have a recent article in Oxford Review that just deals with that one issue with Booker T. Washington. Rather than engaging in futile exchange with the establishment, he drew on his pedagogic belief that vocational education had liberal prospects, and that such as the inculcation of an attitude to self-help and entrepreneurship. He further believed that vocational learning could be the content for teaching academic content. And we've seen Lewi and Wenger and others advocate this. Washington was bent on the project of helping slaves become citizens. That is still the challenge in the US. He was using the unlikely vehicle of vocational education to do that. He died in 1915 at about the time John Dewey's Democracy and Education was published. At the time of Washington's death, in the first decade of the 20th century, a movement for the introduction of vocational education in the schools, supported by federal funding, had crystallized. The movement was multifaceted. You had labor and capital on the same side of an issue. Its intellectual leader was David Snedden, then the Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts, and a scholar and a professor at about the same time at Teachers College, Columbia. The aim was to convince the Congress that vocational education was an economic imperative. Thus, a federal commission on aid to vocational education was convened. John Dewey was opposed to this commission and its aims of introducing vocational education in the schools. He felt that this will give the employing class too much of a say in what would transpire in classrooms, too much of a hold on education. He felt that education was a larger project than just kowtowing to the goals of the employing class. He wrote that the oft-cited experience of Germany as to the importance of industrial education must be weighed in connection with the purpose which has dominated Germany's efforts, which was frankly nationalistic. The state is what held priority. The state as a moral entity is supreme. The state as opposed to the individual. Dewey said there is a grave danger that holding up as a model the educational methods by which Germany had made its policy effective will serve as a cloak for measures calculated to promote the interests of the employing class. He was worried that the school would become an instrument of the industrialists. David Snedden countered in a reply to Dewey, saying that those of us who have been seeking to promote the development of vocational education in schools have become accustomed to the opposition of our academic brethren, and so on. Dewey took the opportunity to set forth what his objections were. He said, I object to the identification of vocations such as trades as can be learned by the age of 18 or so, and to identification of education with the acquisition of skill. I am completely opposed to giving the power of social predestination by means of a narrow trade training to any group of fallible men, no matter how intentioned they may be. He said, it seemed to me that the business of all who would not be educational time servers is to resist every move in this direction and to strive for a vocational education which will alter the existing industrial system and transform it. This was social reconstruction at play in his thinking. Dewey was to lose the debate if we use the passage of the Smith-Hughes Act authorizing funding for vocational education as the measure. In reflecting on this exchange between Dewey and Snedden, one writer, Walter Drost, says we have to look through the lens of social efficiency and social reconstruction. Advocates of social efficiency want graduates from the school systems who could work. They must have useful skills. Drost contends that David Snedden took this to an extreme. He said Snedden carried the principle further. He urged that schools should project the probable social and occupational destination of each student and prescribe a curriculum to fit him efficiently to his place. These ideas of Snedden were to influence American education for a good 50 years after the passage of the Smith-Hughes Act. Dewey was seeing schooling another way, in a grander way. Snedden was seeing this kind of education in terms of social control. Snedden had an aversion for liberal education. He said a large part of the effort which we expend on liberal education is directed by aims which are the outgrowth of custom, crude psychological analysis, and vague aspirations after culture and social efficiency. These aims do not yet stand the test of efficiency, as should aims that are scientifically derived and purposely pursued. He said vocational and general education differed in their aims, and they will differ in their means and so on. But this philosophy of separation of liberal and vocational education leads inexorably to separation of types of students. Who should get vocational education and who should get academic? And that philosophy is to a large extent the foundation of inequality in educational offerings. In his Democracy and Education, Dewey had written out his ideal, his vocational ideal. His ideas on this count could be seen especially in that book, where he said democracy is about associated living. It can be characterized by two criteria: whether the society gives primacy to shared interests or to the narrow interests of an elite. Shared interests versus the narrow interests of an elite. And the degree of interplay and cooperation between groups. The degree of interplay and cooperation between groups. John Dewey is saying that that is a key to constructing democracy. The more shared undertakings there are across groups, the better the prospects for harmony. His view was that the separation into a privileged and a subject class prevents social endosmosis. You can't have a democracy if people are polarized. What you will end up there is with a plural society where people mix but don't combine. That M.G. Smith has talked about. According to Dewey, the value of interpenetrating social existences as groups find common undertaking is that it fuels the demand for education. The devotion of democracy to education is a familiar act, he wrote. The devotion of democracy to education. Or you could, but by a longer route. Herbert Klebard, my colleague at Wisconsin, paints a grim picture in his reflection on that period. He says that Tayloristic notions of efficiency inform the curriculum, as Snedden's social efficiency ethic found expression. Black students found themselves in vocational programs that focused on low wages. Girls who offered home economics found themselves not to be marketable. Kleber documents that just as Dewey had feared, the introduction of vocational education in the schools effectively led to the operation of two school systems, each with distinctly different claims. By 1954, unequal schooling was challenged in the courts by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. These were different times, with several decades of separation from the initial Plessy ruling of 1896. This time the court held unanimously, and we were talking about what the Indian Supreme Court just ruled on. In 1954, the American Supreme Court held unanimously that racial segregation in public schooling stood against provisions of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The clause prevents states from denying citizens of any rights to them by law. While this victory in the courts was not a guarantee for equal rights, it provided a constitutional background against which the struggle could go on. America in 1954, even after the Brown decision, remained a society in which blacks were treated unequally in every realm of existence, not just in schools, in toilets, in buses, restaurants, and so on. Yep, they talked about unequal schools, but did not address unequal curricula. But within the same school, you could have segregation, and that is what happened. And you could, if you read Jonathan Kozol, Death at an Early Age, and Savage Inequalities, you would see his documentation of what was passing for schooling in American inner cities. Scholars like Jeannie Oakes, preeminent scholar on this question, talks about tracking within the school, or in the British system we call it streaming. But it's not just streaming on lines in terms of who is smart and who is not so smart and so on. Sometimes it's based on who has money, who does not, who is white, who is not, and so on. She says tracking is a practice of dividing students into separate classes and so forth. The bottom line is that tracking is a bad thing. The practice of tracking makes both the goals of excellence and equity in the schools unreachable, she says. The children across tracks experience schools differently. Children not in the top tracks suffer from the experience. They decline academically. Tracking exaggerates initial differences between students. Minority and black students are disproportionately placed in low tracks. And you have several studies like Alexander and McDell, Alexander and Cook, and others, and Lucas, who I think is the most important tracking researcher now, because he is showing a more insidious approach to tracking. For example, different levels of mathematics in the same school, consumer mathematics, calculus, and so on, being apportioned on the basis of SES. In an essay titled American Schooling and Inequality, a Forecast for the 21st Century, Adam Gamoran projected that inequality on racial grounds will diminish, continuing a trend he sees in the 20th century because of fighting in the courts and so on. But he noticed that racial gaps between whites and blacks, they have diminished but not disappeared. Rates of high school graduation reach parity, but not rates of college attendance. About 27% of whites going on to college compared to 12% of blacks. In my own study on tracking and inequality in the US, where we got responses from 665 administrators in schools, among the things we prompted them to do was to indicate the spread of students across tracks in the schools, how many were in vocational and so on. And then we asked them to make predictions about the destinations of the students. Where will their students go? Will they go directly to work? Will they go on to 2-year college or 4-year colleges and so on? And what we found in that study was that how schools allocated students correlated significantly with the percentage of students receiving free and reduced price lunches in the school, and that is the marker for socioeconomic status. Some schools give a free lunch to students who are poor and so on. The socioeconomic status of the school body dictated the track. As indicated earlier, this question of America's standing in the global economy came into question in the late decades of the last century. This has prompted a new round of concern about inequality. So if you don't have a moral basis for attacking the problem, at least you have an economic one. And you had a group producing a document called A Nation at Risk that made a connection between education, educational quality, and ability to perform in the global economy. And this led George Bush and his ascension to promote this No Child Left Behind legislation. It is remarkable that Bush was able to get the Democrats to have this unlikely coalition on what looked, on paper at least, as a moral issue, introducing morality into the discussion of economic efficiency. The intent of that act, No Child Left Behind, is set forth in section 1001. And the act is to have all children have fair and equal and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education, ensuring high quality through standards and testing and so on. The act has received full marks for its moral content, but poor marks for how it was carried out. Even black scholars now are disenchanted by the act and so forth. But we have President Obama as president continuing support of No Child Left Behind and investing in new initiatives through the National Science Foundation and so on to have more black students get into science and technology and so on, the areas where they feel students need to be educated if they are to be competitive. Now I want just one last point on this, and that is that a 2014 report this year shows that blacks and Hispanics and American Indians make up 10% of the science and engineering workforce, and are 13% of people who receive degrees in engineering. So this question of competitiveness now is fueling again cries to call for reduction of inequality. Let me get to some conclusions. In examining the American case of perpetual inequality and perpetual debate on the national agenda, several kinds of considerations come to the fore. One obvious question relates to obligations that we could hold states against when it comes to the question of equal opportunity in education. What are states obligated to do on this question? If we turn to UNESCO for answers, you see that from the standpoint of UNESCO, states have obligations with respect to 4 essential features, namely the availability accessibility, the acceptability, and the right to education. So you could say that there is a sort of a consensus way in which we could look at this, right? That from UNESCO's standpoint, a state must be held to the provisions of the World Declaration of Education for All. So that is one place we could look. But in the US, the issue of black education goes beyond basic UNESCO concerns. The American problem is congenital. The American problem on inequality in education on racial lines is a deep one. The roots are buried in the country's history. That is why it recurs again and again. It is connected with entrenched power arrangements that particular communities would not relinquish. They are going to hold on to this. UNESCO can talk of basic fairness and so on, but it really cannot prescribe to states on matters that are historical or cultural. UNESCO can't tell the Indian Supreme Court how to pronounce. That is a local matter. History is what they're up against there. The American state seems to be propelled to act on the question of inequality, not so much out of moral suasion, but on utilitarian impulses, especially when it appears that the country's economic future is linked to education. Women in science, that's been there for decades. So now, let's have more women in science. The problem at hand with respect to equality seems to be a Kantian one, more in the realm of deontology than of mere utility. Should we not expect states to do what is right, as opposed to perpetually conceding to history and social convention and failing to deal decisively with critical questions of rights? The question of equality of opportunity is made more complex and more suggestive of compromise if we take into account John Rawls's two principles of justice. I heard my colleague made reference. According to Rawls, and I think I also heard you talk about the different kinds of discrimination, and I was a little puzzled by it. But according to Rawls, the first principle of justice, paraphrased, is that each person must have access to the same regime of basic liberties as the other. And the second principle is that where there is inequality in social or economic realms, such arrangements should be to everyone's advantage. So there are times when it's okay to have inequality, according to Rawls. From this, Rawls arrives at the general rules that all social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, are to be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution of any, all of these, is to anyone's advantage. So if goods are distributed equally, the starting point is ruffled by inequalities that make everyone better off, then that's okay. The troubling idea here is the one that would have us uphold a regime that admits to being unequal, on the argument that without the arrangement at hand, things could get worse. Rawls draws on Burke and Hegel and Keynes to make the point that there are times when equality of opportunity as a rule could be violated if such a situation leads to increased wealth for all. Equality of opportunity for all could also have the effect of dampening the creativity of those who, under such conditions, might refuse to take risk. Rawls's arguments are intriguing, but they stop well short of saying that we could be satisfied with the asymmetrical distribution of any good, even when such distribution perpetually finds one group in the society to be the group with fewer goods, particularly when the good in question is education. What makes Dewey's democratic idea a more easily digestible proposition compared to Rawls' this premise is Dewey's notion of democracy as an idea that requires perpetual questioning and over which special interests should not have domain. The stance of social reconstruction to which Dewey subscribed would allow questioning of a rigidity such as the one about which this essay has been engaged. Inequality in education in the United States, where blacks are concerned, and I don't know how it is in India, is a matter about which the question of justice has to be brought to the fore again and again, if need be. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. We have 10 minutes for questions, so please do keep your questions very short. The lady there.
My name is Anshumala. Even if we were to assume education is a social good or an opportunity for equal distribution, I never see that education has ever been dissociated from privileges or utilitarian goods in society. And since privileges by definition are scarce, are less, and are not available to everybody, so education will be eventually tied to, or people will make a beeline for the privileges that education gets tied to. So people having more education will have more privileges, as simple as that. And societies which are ordered around unequal goods, unequal privileges, or unequal resources to citizens, how can education itself be then democratic? Unless education was completely de-linked from any kind of privilege. Has it ever been done in history?
I don't know the answer to the last part of that, but I think we can't accept that as the status quo, that a society will be based forever and ever on inequality of whatever privilege. I think democracy calls for us to rail against inequality. Not necessarily to be up in arms against people who have more than we do. That's not what I'm talking about. But for the right to get there, I think there has to be an ideal. A society must have an ideal. And the society must have clear pathways and fair pathways to which people can get there. Education is one of those pathways. Good schools for the children of the poorest. I mean, that is a very, very important starting point. I believe in that. I think blacks in America, when you play cells, I think that is what they want. And it is when you disrupt that avenue, where you have bad schools as a natural condition, that your schools will be bad if you're from that side of the fence. That's the problem. And I think if you analyze any society and you find a rigidity like that, where the haves are going to have good schools and the have-nots are going to have poor schools, you're solidifying and you're perpetuating that rigidity across generations. That is not democracy. So I don't know whether there have been societies that have sorted that out, but that is a democratic ideal, has to be that we can't have that.
Thank you very much, Theodore, for that presentation. I'd like to raise a question about Rawls, who I think you quite rightly criticised, but I wonder if there's also a problem with Dewey's approach as well. And I'll just start with Rawls's treatment, which you draw attention to, of the primacy of greatest equal liberty. Now, Rawls says that this isn't just a formal principle to do with permission, but he doesn't really follow up on that, because his third best-known difference principle is the only one that brings to bear the question of resources in justice. And if liberty is not to be a purely formal principle, one would have thought that the issue of distribution of resources has to take place at that level. You cannot discuss greatest equal liberty without discussing distribution of resources at the same time. And I think this bears a great deal on what you said in the earlier part of your presentation about some of the problems of the financing of the American education system. Mm-hmm. So I agree, there is a major problem for a Rawlsian approach there. And I think in addition to that, he doesn't address the issue of relative inequalities. The difference principle only bears on absolute allocation of resources. But just to conclude that point, it doesn't seem to me that Dewey gets to grips with this issue either in Democracy in Education, and I just would be interested in your comments on that point.
Well, I think Dewey gets more basic than this. What Dewey says is education is the route in the American context, that if we want to get a democratic society, then we have to educate people who are able to fashion and to play out the norms and values of that society. So inequality of opportunity to education is a real stumbling block for Dewey in the discussion of democracy. It starts with schooling. It starts there. And that is I really believe in that ideal. I don't think that what people are after are resources and wealth. Ultimately, they can get there. I think that what people, the underprivileged, the underclasses, want is unobstructed approaches to the means of wealth that they see. And I think Dewey reinforces that notion. And Chris, I don't know if that...
So I had a question around the liberal vocational divide and issue of social justice. What I seem to struggle with is, does having specialized kind of education always lead to predestination in a context? Or would you have, especially in case of a country like India, which is quite diverse in what different parts of the society want to achieve, could you have different types of education in that are relevant? Because we constantly hear people dropping out of school because they don't find it relevant. So is this always a tension, or is it a design issue of how you design your curriculum and your schools?
It's a design issue for the whole system. If you think about education as a highway, a freeway with lanes, different lanes, academic, vocational, and so on. There are people who are artistic, people in music, and so on. The best designs would be one where people can change lanes. There's opportunity to change lanes in the course of time, so that you are not stuck in the lane in which you initially found yourself. So that if you are 18 in India and you did a course in automotive or something like that, and you became a mechanic, and you worked in that for a year or 2 or 3, and then you found that you want to be an engineer, the society shouldn't say to you that there is no way in which you can now do that. The society has to have crosswalks that will allow you to go ahead and do that. It's not easy design, but it's doable design. It has to be conceived that way so that you don't have people stuck in lanes. And that is, I don't know how you design. I think in many societies, if you find yourself in the worry you have for finding yourself in the vocational track early on is that you'll never get out. You know, you don't get the levels and so on and so on. So that means the society has to have adult education opportunities. People have to be able to get back in. And this is where I think the American system that I've been talking about here, this is a real strength of the American system. In the American system, you actually can't change lanes. And there are certain kinds of institutions that are very robust in the extent to which they accommodate sort of vocational and theoretical learning, say the community college. So you could go to a community college and get either kind of schooling. And then there are means by which the community college curriculum could be articulated with, say, a regular university and so. So it is a design problem. If you don't design it and you then you have tracks and you have people, like I said, would be in silos. Yeah.
Could you tell us something about the final Supreme Court judgments on affirmative action, particularly with regard to the Michigan case and the Texas case?
I haven't been following that. I say this, in the Michigan case, as I understand it, as I understand the Michigan case, you can, if you're a minority person, you can still, schools can still make minority status be a condition under which they will. I think that's the case. Minority condition would be one of the conditions under which a school could decide to take you into, say, a lower program and so on. That issue has been hanging since the Bakke case, and that is, can you use the race of a person to make some kind of qualification that will allow them to enter ahead of somebody else who might be more or better qualified.
That is
Yes,
correct.
yes.
Until there was a referendum, on the issue, a state referendum that reversed it. And then the university appealed to the Supreme Court. And I wondered what the judgment was.
I don't know.
A last question, please.
I'm a teacher trainer working in Pondicherry. I met a number of parents as a counselor. When I counsel them to admit their wards into vocational education, they are thinking about social stigma. General education is meant for only elite people and vocational education is meant for slow learners. So what is the context being prevalent in America? Vocational education increases employability skills. Even though number of times I convince parents to admit their wards into vocational education, I became a very poor counselor. So could you substantiate this with a special reference to America?
There is a contextual issue here. In the United States, and interestingly, influenced by the ideas of Dewey, who talks about a more liberally conceived vocational education, not something that tracks you into a particular domain. And so you do have this Deweyan approach to vocational education. Within the school, within the high school, that approach shies away from leading people down single, narrow pathways. There are places beyond school, so you can pursue a vocational pathway, but at the same time, you're also doing liberal things. Beyond the high school, you can go into a technical school, or you can go into a community college, and even there, you have opportunity to change your mind. And that is the issue as you go from one society to the next. Does the society allow you to change your mind in education? If the society doesn't have the wherewithal to allow you to change your mind, then the parents have to be worried that if the children make a too early decision to go into a vocational track, then they're stuck in that track forever. So I don't know how that helps you in India. In India, it might be that practically, if one issue there might be jobs. If the vocational track can get you to hold a stable job, that you can keep a family together, stable, then, and you're in that track, then okay. But the society has to think about designs that will allow you not to be stuck in tracks, especially in your teen years.
Thank you very much.